Scott County, providing safe, healthy, and livable communities.
To talk about risk management and our Scott County delivers. And as you looked at your packet, when you received it over the weekend, you probably saw that this is, we're calling kind of a version 2. It's still one that is individual area risk management. It's not a broad group of folks yet. And as you looked at some of the measures and where they're headed, a lot of it is the future and moving forward and developing some of these measures. So this one is even at a little different point than some of the other ones we've talked about. But we thought it's such an important topic to the county that we get it out in front of you here for discussion and allow you to ask some questions and provide some input on it. So with that, I'll have the panel introduce themselves, and then we'll turn it over to Jen for a few minutes to kick it off.
Time out. Just before you start that, it occurred to me I was asked to make this one announcement to the citizens at home. We've had some technical issues with live streaming this morning, so we're just coming up online like 5 minutes ago, or just as we were recessing. So anyone that's tuning in and thinking this is the beginning of the meeting, it's not the beginning of the meeting. This is actually item 12 on the agenda. So if you had your heart set at home on watching us live stream, sorry about that. It will be in the archives eventually, but this is item 12 on the agenda if you're watching at home. Administrator Sheldon.
I was going to point out, Mr. Chair, that it will be in the archives, and it will also be broadcast on the cable stations if they have cable.
A couple of ways to watch it, see what we're up to here. So, thank you for letting me interrupt. Introductions. Leslie, go ahead.
Steve, go ahead.
I'm Steve Jones from the Office of Management and Budget.
Kara Madsen, Office of Management and Budget. I handle the volunteer program.
Jennifer Schultz, Office of Management and Budget, and I specifically work on contracts, procurement, and risk management.
Jennifer Boyd-Bolson. I work in Office of Management and Budget, and I am a procurement specialist.
Maria Heller. I also work in the Office of Management and Budget, and I work with contracts as well.
Greg Ilka, I'm with Community Services Planning and Analysis.
Pam Selvig, Health and Human Services.
Good morning, Scott Anderson from IT.
And Leslie Vermillion, the Deputy Director. Jen.
All right. Well, good morning, and I'm actually really excited to be here today. I know that maybe risk management isn't the most exciting thing to talk about, but I think it's a really important. It's important to talk about because risk is in everything we do. Nothing that we do here at the county doesn't have some level of risk. And so, as I was trying to think about how do I kick this off, I'm not talking about protecting children or crossover youth or building highways. I'm talking about risk. I thought about when we first started about this idea of enterprise risk management here in the county. Kevin and I started talking about how do we describe this, how do we talk about this? And we used an analogy, and I'll draw your attention to page 5 of the slides. And a lot of this information that we have in our slides, because we are in the development, was intended to be informational. So just give a flavor for what is enterprise risk management. But I like this slide because I think it really kind of depicts what we're trying to do. And that roadmap really looks at where do we want as an organization to be on this road? Where are we most comfortable? And I'll call that risk appetite. So as an organization, as the leaders of the organization, where are we comfortable? Are we comfortable between the, kind of the side and the center lane, just straight going down? Or are we comfortable taking some risks at time, higher level risks, sometimes veering off to the side of the road? Or, the really obvious one being off the guardrail. And some organizations are okay there too. But it's kind of deciding where are we okay on this map. And so the easiest way for me to kind of put it into perspective is thinking about every morning when I get in my car to drive to work, I assume some level of risk by just being in my car and being on that road. I was traveling this morning on County Road 21 to get here, and this morning was a little different because when I got in the car, it was raining and it was coming down pretty good. And that changes things. So that changes the impact of my morning commute. So now I have to not only think about just being in the car, but I have to think about what do the road conditions mean? What's going on? Those are the impacts of those day-to-day situations. So I have to now consider that. And then I have to think about, on the flip side of that, how vulnerable am I? Do I have a car that has good tires? What are the road conditions and things like that? What's my past experience of, excuse me, traveling in rainy conditions? And all of those start to kind of draw that map of what my commute's going to be like in the morning and where am I comfortable on that road. So I may be very comfortable, my appetite may be that I'm generally good when I'm driving between that medium and high, you know, conditions are good, I'm moving along. But this morning, I was probably more comfortable in the medium to low, just driving down, not going to necessarily veer out and pass somebody because of the conditions of the road. And I think that really speaks to when we're making decisions on whether it's projects or the day-to-day programs that we do here at the county. I think our staff are constantly making those kinds of decisions, and they're looking at the impacts, and they're looking at how vulnerable we are, and they're using that information to make informed decisions and provide that information to our leaders. So that just is kind of my story of risk and why it's important. I think this morning we have folks here from the Office of Management and Budget. I think I probably could have brought anybody up to this table because I think everybody in the organization is looking at risk on a day-to-day basis. So whether it's child protection, they're assessing levels of risk. Again, whether it's we're building a highway, whether it's people out snow plowing, everybody's doing some level of risk assessment on a day-to-day basis. So I just kind of want to open it up with kind of our view of what risk is.
Thank you. All right, panel.
Well, I appreciate your start, Jen, and as I struggled with this a bit as I tried to wrap my head around kind of where you're going here with this, because there was some new terminology that I hadn't heard before. So, and you talked about child protection and other areas, mental health. We're making risk decisions every day that impacts people's lives and that kind of thing. So when you talk about, in this context, an enterprise risk management, an integrated risk approach, are we talking here specifically as it relates to OMB and contracts, or is there somehow some vision for a larger discussion or piece here?
And that's I think that's a great question. And so, and I didn't really mention this in my opening, but I don't really view what we do as a program. I view it as a framework, as a methodology, as tools for what folks can do in their day-to-day work. So from a bigger, broader perspective, we've had the opportunity now on a couple of occasions, and I put in the packet, and you'll see on, I believe it's pages, let me see, maybe 10 and 11, some examples of maybe bigger organizational-wide decisions where there were some cross, more enterprise type, where we really did sit down as a group and do a more formal type of assessment and talk through, get the stakeholders in the room, talk through what are the impacts, what are our vulnerabilities, and looking at that from a more organizational-wide. But again, in terms of what people are doing day to day, they're doing a lot of this probably just in they're assessing, they're identifying, they're mitigating, they're deciding. So there's really kind of three options with risk. Once you've identified and once you've assessed, you can choose to mitigate. So if I do this, this will lower our risk. We can choose to transfer the risk, try to put the risk somewhere else so it's not on what we're doing, or we can avoid it altogether. And so I think staff, again, in the decisions that they're making day to day, they're doing those things. And a lot of times, some of our, what we do in contracts, for example, or what we do with our volunteers, what we do in our post-retirement, we're doing mitigation strategies all the time to try to lower the risks to the organization. And I think that's what child protection is doing too. In those bigger conversations, my belief is it's a way to provide information to our decision makers to kind of look at what does this big picture mean, and what if we make this decision or we enter into this project or we move forward with this strategy, what does that potentially mean to the organization? So I think it's both. It's kind of a convoluted answer, but I think it's a little bit of both. I think we're doing it the day-to-day, and I think there's opportunities to do it enterprise as well.
So following up on Pam's, when you take a look at departments, if If a department uses standards for what they follow or practices that are identified, are you looking at those versus working with ones that maybe don't have those in place yet? Like, I believe you started with contracts for a reason, probably.
Right. And I agree. And right, I mean, we're not certainly experts in those fields. Everybody's the experts in those departments, and a lot of our departments have those standards already in place. And Leslie and I've had many conversations about highway, so I will use that one as an example. There are very, in some of the contracts that we do for roads, it's very prescribed by the state, it's very prescribed by the feds, depending on where the money's coming from. And in some of those situations, we don't have the level of risk because they're following very specific standards. I would say child protection, there's probably some of those very specific standards as well. But in other areas where we don't necessarily have that laid out as well, this is an opportunity to have the conversation and talk about it and look at things like what could we put in place for the processes, for policies to help create those standards and lower our risk as an organization.
Well, how do you decide which things you're going to look at and evaluate risk for versus which maybe you don't fall in your domain or fall someplace else? Are you proactively seeking out opportunities to examine risk, or is it mostly as a result of a new contract or new initiative that is coming up?
I'm not sure we have because we're just really in the beginning phases. I don't know if I have a good answer to that question, Scott. I think it's been, to date, it's been opportunities that our leaders have said, this would be a good opportunity for us to really take a look at the risk and what risks are out there. So for example, what we did with the PCI and what we've done with the small cellular, those were opportunities that were presented as, we really want to take a deeper dive at what some of those risks may present with the decisions that we're going to make. On a day-to-day basis, for contracts, for example, when we're doing our reviews and or drafting contracts, we're thinking about risk on a pretty regular basis. So we're reviewing for risk to see, that scope or how we wrote those payments. Are we exposing the county to any, undue risk, that kind of thing. And that's been a pretty standard practice that we've done for a number of years. We've tried to streamline that to some degree about, are there templates we can put in place on some of those routine types of contracts and such. But the other opportunities where we've done more of a formalized assessment, those have been opportunities that, again, where leaders in particular areas have asked questions. Well, what does this mean? What kind of risks are presented in these kinds of decisions? And we've sat down, brought stakeholders together, and then had those conversations.
Jen, pages 6 and 7 looks at a couple different tools. They're both kind of rating criteria, impact rating, as well as I think the other one's around vulnerability. How do you see these tools as being used and for what purpose? And are they currently being used? And
Yep, good question. And so, so when I look at the framework of enterprise risk management through the research and kind of looking at what does it mean, how do you do it, consistently there's two things that you look at, the impact. So really impact, in other words, can be what's the consequences to the organization. So we want to look at things, and I think very historically we've done a really good job as an organization of looking at things like safety impacts, because that's just right there in the front. One of our goals is to keep our citizens safe. So we're looking at safety. But impacts can be more than just safety. So we can have impacts to our finances, depending on the decisions that we make. We can have impact to our reputation. One of the things throughout my career I've been told a million times, you don't want to end up on the front page of the Star Tribune. That's just not typically a good place to be. So we don't want to necessarily to be there in a negative way. Sometimes it's good publicity too. But so to our reputation, what's the impact to our employees if we do this project, if we make this decision, if we move forward with this strategy as an organization? What's the impact to our citizens? So it's really looking at all of those different categories, and for different things, it could mean the rating criteria could be different. So again, I'll go back to my 2 slides where we talked about the PCI compliance, and that's really compliance with when we're taking credit cards. Are we making sure that we're keeping people's data safe and secure? And then we also did some assessment on that small cellular. So that project was really about placing small cellulars on our light poles, street poles out there in the community that was being requested. So anyway, so safety, for example, would look very different in both of those situations. So safety for a PCI project, for example, we'd be talking about cyber safety, right? Making sure people's data, we're not breaching that. That would be our safety criteria there. On this other project with the small cellular, where we're placing objects on poles, and we were talking more about making sure sight lines are free, and we don't want people to be in accidents. We don't want a fatality necessarily because something was obstructed. So safety looked very different in both of those projects. So there isn't really on that criteria. Again, it just becomes a tool depending on what the decision or the situation is at hand. And the stakeholders have to fill that out because it's going to be different for each situation. So that kind of talks about, that's the impact piece. On the flip side then, we talk about, and this is slide 7, vulnerability. And what that really gets at to is how vulnerable are we as an organization? And my simplest way to put that is, do we have the right people in place? Do we have the right processes in place? And do we have the right policies in place? Because it really gets at, we're less vulnerable when we have the right staff in place who are trained, who are educated, they know their job, they're making good decisions. We are less vulnerable as an organization when we have good processes in place and we're not just willy-nilly out making decisions, but we're following process. So on that scale, we get less vulnerable, which is a good thing when we have those things in place. So it's taking a look at that. And again, each situation is going to be very different. So then those become your access points. You got your impact, you got your vulnerability. Depending on where they score, then you end up with slide 8, which is that heat map. And I'll just kind of draw folks' attention to the heat map, because what I really like about this is it's a visual and it shows all the risks that were identified, and it shows you in a picture where do they fall on this heat map. So clearly in the red zone, it would tell you that, hey, those are probably risks that we want to take a look at. We want to know more about them. We want to know if we can mitigate those risks, or we might want to avoid them. We might want to say, yep, that's just too much. We don't want to take this on. Down in the green area, when we fall into those, when our risks fall into there, that's really, yep, there's some risk because there's risk in everything we do, but that's where we maybe deploy. We don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time there because they're not risks. We got the right people in place. We got the right policies in place. And then in the 2 yellow zones, you just want to look at more of a, okay, how many are there? How many are coming at us at one time? And again, it's just an opportunity for us to move those risks around based on what we do from a mitigation perspective. So that's a big overview. I think this happens, and again, it's just intended strictly to be tools that staff can use. Doesn't have to be a huge drawn out process. On smaller type things, they're probably doing this, again, I'm doing this in my head when I'm driving in my car. My impacts this morning was specifically the weather. My vulnerability, although I really don't have bad tires, could have been if I had bad tires, that would have changed my heat map for this morning.
Leslie, can you take a question from this commissioner? Jennifer's talking about a heat map here, and I'm looking at the placement in the quadrants. And I'm thinking, who makes this call? Is this somewhat subjective or is it objective? Is it a team effort? The size of the dot, the placement of the dot, that strikes me as very important when you're putting a heat map together.
Yep, that's a really good question, Commissioner.
And if you already talked about it and I missed it, I apologize, but say it again and I'll listen more carefully.
No problem. So the placements of the dots comes from the evaluation you do on the impact criteria and the vulnerability. And that has to be a team effort.
Okay.
So you would want to get the right stakeholders in the room that have the right information. So that's really our subject matter experts who know about the situation or the decision that we're making. And we go through that process and identify and then rank them on the impact and the vulnerability, again, based on the criteria that we've set. And then once that's done, then the dots just fall where they fall. The one thing I haven't mentioned, but you kind of alluded to this, the size of the dots. So you notice on that heat map, there's different sizes up there. And that's really a third criteria that tells an organization how quickly that risk is coming at you. So the larger the dot, it would tell you, yep, that risk is next month or in a couple of months. Versus if it's a smaller dot, and even if it's in the red area, for example, but we have a year to mitigate it, that becomes a less of a risk for us because we've got some time to make some decisions and have conversations about what we could do to mitigate that. So the size of the dots are important too. So again, it's an opportunity to provide information is how I look at that heat map.
And I would also add, having sat on both of these two, that having a cross team of people do it, Mr. Chairman, was really valuable. So you had different perspectives sitting on it and not just one department, because there's a broader view sometimes to these. And so I thought that was beneficial too as well.
And that's a great point. Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily want to do this with just one viewpoint. You would want to bring in a cross-section from the various departments and have that conversation.
Good, thanks.
So if we could change subject and jump into some actual data that you
Yeah.
provide. I'm looking at page 11.
Okay.
I got a few questions. My first one is, help me understand the implications about risk that the story you're telling me here.
Yep.
And then help me understand the definition of your phases, agreements, solicitation requirements.
Okay. So I will start with the first question about implications. So these are some of the data that we have in here, and specifically related to the contracting and purchasing is what we started with our data when we first started delivering What Matters. And we felt that it was important to kind of look at from when we get contacted by a department that and this is specifically related to an RFP process, to the point that then we have a contract in place. And so where I think this fits with our risk is, I think when we do the processes like an RFP process, we limit our risk because we're going through a solicitation process when we need to. We don't always need to, but these would be more tied to some of our bigger capital projects. So we've gone through a formalized process, and we've, again, with the goal in mind that we've eliminated some of the risks of potentially having folks, or having somebody come back and challenge us later, because we have followed the process and some of those statutory requirements. So I think that's where some of this risk piece ties in. When I was looking at this data, the other thing that I'll just draw your attention to, and we don't have any data for this yet, and that's, that would be page, so it's slide 4, or page 14, sorry. And this is one new one that we thought that might be good to start to measure too, and this would be data when we choose to use more of a cooperative type purchasing opportunity. So the state has multiple contracts in place that we as a county entity can use. There's national contracts that are in place that county entities and local governments can use. Those contracts have already been vetted. They've gone through solicitation processes. So not only does that save us some time, but it also ensures that we've eliminated some of the legal risks that might exist because we're using those processes in place. So eventually, I think that will be a really nice comparison between the processes that we're doing here in the county and then some of the processes that we're utilizing from some of the cooperatives, and are we taking the right advantages with those opportunities. A good example recently, I think, that we did when we were purchasing the mobile library vehicle, that, you know, had we gone out for a process, that maybe would have taken us several months to do, but we were able to utilize a national cooperative, get what we thought was going to be in the best interest of the citizens, and we were able to move that forward quicker. So in that situation, that made sense. So for me, it's some comparison on both of those data points moving forward. And now I forgot your second
Yeah.
question because I talked too long. I'm
So
sorry.
because there's such variability in each of the phases, I was just trying to understand how you defined each phase,
Yep.
this is the start of that phase, this is
Yep.
the end.
And so I will say, I don't think we have very good definition currently of those phases. And I think one of the takeaways that we should probably look better at with this data, and as I was, kind of looking at it in preparation for this, is particularly related to some of the stage gates and some of the phases they've now done with the PMO process. And where does this fit into there? Because prior to us having the PMO office and having the project managers on board, some of those requirements did fall into our phases, and we did some of those pieces, and now some of those processes are changing, and I think for the better, we're doing that earlier. Those requirement pieces are coming in advance then when we're ready to go out. But historically, in the middle of a procurement process, for example, we could have went, oh my gosh, we forgot these requirements, and realized we didn't necessarily do a good job of requirements, and then did a lot of backtracking. So I think that's some of what you're seeing with this as well. And so I think it'll be interesting moving forward too, with the changes in the PMO office and some of the organizational changes we've made. How does that impact these processes? I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yes, it does, thank you.
And maybe along with that too, once you kind of figure out how this impacts the processes with the projects and stuff, once the risks are identified, how does that interact with future plans and budgets even?
I'm not sure I'm understanding.
Like if are there identifying risks, would that change how you look at budgets for specific things if you identify higher risks in certain areas?
I think it should. I don't know if we've matured to that point, but I think, that is kind of the essence of the process, to identify, to assess, and then use that information to make informed decisions. And we're making informed decisions that should impact things like, our budget and our finances and all of those things that go along with making the decision. So we're moving towards that. Again, I don't think we've necessarily matured to that from a real formalized process, but I think that's the direction we'd like to head towards.
It should be part of the weight, though, as far as the priority of our limited resources. You don't want to put your resources into a high-risk area if you have a more low-risk type of program that has a higher rate of return to it. So it is something that we would try to use. Granted, it would just be another condition, though, not just on risk.
Right. It shouldn't be just on but you would tie that in. And we've talked about, and again, not necessarily formalize this, but how does that play in with the priority-based budgeting?
That's what I was curious about. Yeah, how the risk mitigation might tie in with the scoring of the of those.
So Maria, you deal in contracts, and page 11 has you take out number 14, I think it changes the average considerably. But what do you do in contracts that help businesses speed up or make them move quicker through the system? What do you do, or what have you guys done to help make us more efficient?
Some of what we've looked at is if departments are using boilerplates that we've tried to put out there, a lot of times the reviews go a lot quicker because there is standard language in those boilerplates that don't have to be reviewed if those are being used. Then we can focus more on the scope of services, making sure that's clear. We don't want scope of services or specifications out there that maybe down the road, if there's some confusion on what it really means, could slow down a project or delay a project. So we try to look at those things. If they're the same contracts coming back year after year, if nothing's really changed in them, we can kind of move those through a little bit quicker. Anything that needs, that's unique, that we haven't seen before, we would work more closely with the attorney's office and getting those gone through as far as the scope itself. So anytime we can use our boilerplates, that will speed up the process as well.
What percent of contracts are boilerplates? I mean, when you look at how many we put through the process, which helps us be more efficient, I'm assuming, so we don't.
Yeah, I think a lot of them can be boilerplate, but your scope of services is usually different for the most part. I know a lot of what I work with now are renewals, So, or if we get some from the state, those are usually pretty consistent. So those move a lot quicker too. Those are some of the things we're looking at.
And I think a couple of things, just to add to what Maria said, that are this key in my experience with contracts, is the risk part of contracts comes in how we write payments and how we write scopes. So one of the additional things I think that we try to do, Leslie, because we don't have a centralized procurement, we're decentralized, and the departments are purchasing and contracting for what they need for their goods and services. As the purchasing department, we try to provide guidance, we try to provide education, we try to provide that liaison with the attorney's office to make sure that we're limiting our risk. We make sure that boilerplates are up to date because statutes change and things like that. But 90% of a contract is boilerplate language, and if we stay up to date on the statutes and those things, we're good. But then when we get to the scope of service and the payment piece, that's about how we write those. So another piece that I would say that we try to do on a very regular basis is educate and work with staff. How do you write a good scope of service? What information needs to be in there so that at the end of the day, if there's any disagreement about did we get what we paid for, those deliverables are written well, and we have that to go back on if we need to. So again, I think another piece that we do is that working with staff and in the different departments in education and training.
So Steve, how did you use risk when you were looking at the retiree health insurance funding, what you did there?
Where we looked at risk for retiree health is that we knew we had the future costs coming on board in the upcoming years, and we knew it would just keep growing on us. So we determined it would be best to set aside some funds early so that as these expenses start coming through, that we could have a pool of dollars to help absorb those costs and not hurt the organization for other programs. So we really looked at it more from the financing of the actual retiree health insurance. And with retiree health insurance, we already had the agreements in place, so there wasn't any way that we could change what benefit we offered. So it really did become more of a financing strategy rather than a benefit strategy.
So what did you take a look at when you were making those decisions, though? You must have had, and you made one recently, didn't you, even with the 16 and 17 budget, some decisions?
Yeah, up front, what we looked at is the investment tools that we have as a county is very limited. We have very low risk opportunities, low rate of returns. But the state legislature did allow us the opportunity to go through the Minnesota Board of State Investments, or State Board of Investments, and use higher rate of return investments. So that's where we really focused our funds then, was in that trust. And at the start of our investment, and this is really looking at slide 18 there, or sorry, slide 16, is that up front we had such a low principal balance for this that we did put our funds into the areas where it was probably higher risk but more reward available to it, and we really needed to grow the funds. Well, now that we've gotten over 60% of the fund, or of the future benefits covered, we have moved the funds now to a lower risk area to really make sure that we save our principal balances. But we still have 35% in the higher return areas because we still need to grow that principal.
And I didn't mention this, but just to tag on to that, I think what's really important to think about or to know when you're dealing with risk, I think in general, when I say the word risk, it's generally a negative thing. Something bad's going to happen, or there's something, it's just a negative term. But it's really an opportunity to look at which opportunities we have too. And I think Steve's example is a great example of, yep, there was a risk, but we created an opportunity with that and made a really good decision. And then that fund now is looking much healthier than it previously was. So Part of my goal or part of what, in working with the organization, I want folks to see risk as an opportunity too, because many times, and folks can think about personal examples where I took this risk and these really good things happened. It's not every time I take a risk something negative happens, but historically risk has been kind of seen as negative and as a showstopper. Oh gosh, I gotta go through risk and I'm gonna get shut down and it's gonna take forever and we're gonna have to go through all of these, jump through these hoops. And so part of what this idea of an enterprise risk management is looking at it as, and there's lots of opportunities with it too. And I think, again, that's where it really spreads across all of the organization and the different departments. I think folks do a really nice job of looking, assessing, and creating opportunities too. So that was my little soapbox about risk doesn't have to be negative.
Can I just go back for just a minute to these risk tools, both though, I think it's all kind of interrelated, the impact rating criteria, the vulnerability rating criteria, and the heat maps. I'm just kind of curious, when I think of risk tools in my world, many of them are research-based. We know in child protection factors that impact repeat maltreatment, age of the parent, if there's mental health issues, all kinds of things that are research-based. Are these tools research-based? Do we know that we're kind of looking at the right things based on research out there?
And that's a really good question. So, and I will say that in general, this idea of enterprise risk management is relatively new. Historically, if you talk about risk management, historically it was about insurance and did we have the right insurance in place and safety. And those things are really, really important. But kind of with the crash, when banks started getting into trouble and they started to look at this idea of enterprise risk management and what does it mean from an organization, and now it's starting to filter into government sector as well. Really started in the private sector and has now kind of exploded into government sector. And yes, I mean, there's lots of different research out there, and all of that still comes back to what's the impact and what's the vulnerability. And impact can also be described as kind of the likelihood, how likely is it going to happen, but the tools may look a little bit different, but they all look at kind of identifying the same things. What might be different than in your world, Pam, is because you can't account for every situation, that's where we have to talk through what is the highest impact. And that might look different, but it's still looking at those kind of same categories, but the criteria might change a little bit depending on the situation or what we're looking at to assess. But yes, I would say this is in the research, it's out there. If you Googled enterprise risk management, you're going to get exactly what is in your information with a few minor twists to it. This is kind of where we landed after a lot of research and how it would fit into our organization.
Well, I don't want to leave Kara out of this, so I did have one question for her. So that would relate to page, hang on one second, page 21. I'm fairly familiar with the volunteer program. I'm just a little curious around some of the usage pieces, and the two in particular that stood out, the higher usage, the HHS General, as well as the Sheriff's Office. Kind of, what are those to begin with?
Okay, well, the way volunteer fits into this whole scheme here is, Jen had talked a little bit about the risk. So we've got rewarded and we've got unrewarded. So I kind of see myself as the rewarded part of risk. So, hoping to bring volunteers and strategies to the county that we can utilize volunteers in helping the county save money, save on resources, that sort. So in regards to page 21 on the usage, the Sheriff's Office, that's going to be your reserves. So that's why that number is so high compared to Health and Human Services. So, and Health and Human Services General, I mean, New Options falls under Health and Human Services.
Yeah, but that has separate.
Public health, right, right. So the general is just kind of those other pieces. But that's why the sheriff's office, won out in numbers, because the reserves do a lot in volunteer hours. So in that regard, we're doing a little more tracking now moving forward with our volunteers, trying to break it up and to see exactly what departments that they're utilizing. In the past, a majority of our volunteers were utilized in Health and Human Services. Now I've been trying to work and again educate the other departments that we do have volunteers out there and available for other departments to be able to utilize. So we're kind of starting to see some growth. It'll be interesting to see this graph in 2017 to see where we have grown in volunteers.
Kira, I noticed that Adopt a Highway isn't there. That is one to me that Tony, I think, even spoke to the board about a month ago that adds huge value.
Yes.
Huge reward for the hours. We certainly could not have people out cleaning our highways over twice a year, and the hours that must go into that. That seems to me one that we're missing here that we should take a look at.
Exactly, and we could put that under that. That just doesn't fall under my umbrella. That's out of the highway department, so I just don't have those numbers and statistics, but we can definitely put that in there and kind of use that going forward again as we grab numbers from departments.
Are there other areas that we're using volunteer services too, like highway, that maybe aren't accounted for?
Adopt a Highway is probably the main one. In regards to any other volunteers, they usually flow through the volunteer office.
So Karen, do you coordinate all the sheriff's reserves for the sheriff's department?
I help in doing that. So the sheriff reserves, we're still kind of strategizing how we want to run it a little bit, but they basically reach out right to the reserves and they go through a pretty steady training process. And basically that training process, what I've been told by the people that manage the sheriff reserves is if they're still around after training 5 and 6, which can be 10, 15 hours, then maybe they'll become a sheriff reserve. And then once they are approved and brought on board, then I work with them in regards to tracking and some follow-up with them and that sort.
So from a big picture, if you're still kind of asking yourself, well, how does this tie into risk? The way I wrap that up is if you go back again then to the vulnerability impact, right? It really plays into having the right people available to provide the services. And that doesn't necessarily have to be paid staff. We can have some of those right people through our volunteers as well, which then again helps us reduce that financial impact. It helps us reduce that employee impact that may be high because we don't have enough people or we don't have enough money to do some of these things. So as we were, kind of wrapping our head around how does this fit, it does fit. And that's why when I started, I said, I think we can fit this into everything that we do in this organization. Because again, it's just a framework, it's a methodology. So it was great to have Kara participate that and look at that from a different way.
So I'm going to ask you for a specific one. We made, I thought, a risk decision on fingerprinting.
Yes.
How was that one turned out?
Fingerprinting, so we have a new fingerprinting program called NEP 2.0 study that we are doing down in the customer service department. And it has blown up when we first started doing it, from what I understand. The first month that we had this program, we probably saw about 16 people. Now, in an average month, they're seeing 500 plus. So, and we didn't have the availability to staff at this time, or the usage of people coming in for the fingerprinting, I think was a 3.25% kind of a full-time job, something like that. So they reached out to me and asked me for volunteers. So I've been helping to staff that. We staff that for 5 hours a day. And one volunteer works 1 day a week, so we have to be very careful that they're not giving too many hours either, because we have other situations that play into it with union and that sort. So we have 5 individuals that are working 1 day a week, 5 hours a day. So that's helping to alleviate some of the other customer service workers to work with the community to help in other aspects. So, and they're kind of doing the heavy hours. I think it's from 11 to 4. It has been challenging. on my part too, because volunteers, some have volunteered and worked a week or two and felt it was too high stress, and they quit the next day. They don't need to give me a 2 weeks notice, they can quit the next day. So I get contacted, I need somebody else. So we've actually found some areas that we've been able to fit. I think we'll be back up to 5 in the next week or two. I've got a couple college students that are on summer leave right now that are going to help for the summer, and then we're going to kind of have to figure out moving forward. So that's kind of a budget piece too that we spoke about, in that, you know, we see this need, we know we possibly need to hire a full-time staff. We're not there yet. How do we work this? You know, I work very closely with ER, employee relations also, to let them know this is what's going on, this is what's happening, be aware as we move forward, so. Yep.
Where do you see, 2 years from now, where would you see this, and how do you see this work impacting business units? How do you see your work looking differently, and then also how's it going to impact us?
Great question. And I'm not sure I have a great answer, because I think, again, just because we're still in the beginning, I can tell you what I would like to see. I would like us to have, first and foremost, I'd like to be having the conversations. I'd like to be able to, not in all cases, but present some of this information. My vision is a heat map would be great when we're making those big decisions and folks can see that information. I don't know if that's where we're headed. You know, I mean, I think those are the conversations that we need to continue to have, because we're just really in that infancy stage. It's awareness. It's having the conversations. It's not being afraid of risk. It's talking about it. It's and part of it's just continuing to do what our staff does every day, which is good work. So, but it's also that really just looking across the entire organization and not just in the silos, and bringing in the stakeholders together and having the conversation. It may mean we do nothing different, but we've had the conversation. So I don't know. Again, I don't really see this as a program. I see this as tools, as methodology, as framework, as information to be provided as we make those hard decisions. I don't necessarily see a formalized program and it's not to make people to jump through more hoops. It's awareness, it's the conversations, it's making sure that they're being had. It's asking questions. I think a lot with risk is just asking questions and not being afraid of the answers.
So Maria, what would you like to see different in what you do? Or where would you like to be?
Since I've come up here, I've seen some of the changes that I'd like to see as far as we meet with other areas. They have contract staff in those areas, and by setting up those meetings and meeting monthly, we're able to kind of work together. They might have a question we've already dealt with, those types of things. So the communication, the awareness, as Jennifer mentioned, I think is very important.
Jen, you've been really quiet.
And tag along to Maria too, and just make sure that I feel like we don't really have a huge time frame given to us to have these conversations with the vendors that provide services and commodities with us as well, and where they can improve their services and where we can improve our services to them as well.
Kara?
Well, I feel like I use a lot of this every day, but I look forward to seeing how we can transition it a little bit more, see where it breaks down, and kind of where the usage is and how we can fill that with volunteers.
And I really look at it from the whole budget process. Anytime that we have to make decisions with our limited resources, you want as much information as you can have. So if we can validate what is the risk out there with the different decision points, all information's important, so the more we can get, the better.
You see a clear tie with this to what you're doing in PBB?
I do, because especially if we're looking at either expanding or reducing a program, there's risk associated on either side of what is the overall impact to the public and what are financial risks. Going through the whole heat index would be a real benefit for us.
You three?
Good. It's a good explanation for everything. Thank you.
All right, Claire has a question.
You know, if you're listening to the news lately, it seems like the biggest risk for local government has been coming from law enforcement. And I'm wondering, like, when you're trying to determine how much insurance we need to cover incidences that may occur, I mean, we just saw a big lawsuit against Chaska and Carver County for an incident that happened over there. How do you do that, and what else do you do to mitigate the risk? I mean, as far as what kind of investment would you recommend the county make, and maybe more training for our officers or something? How do you mitigate that kind of a risk?
That's a big question, Claire, and I'm not sure I can answer it, to be honest with you. And so I will say, you know, just, and I think I mentioned this earlier, what we do with our insurance, what we do with our safety, as you said, is those are the ways we mitigate that. And I think you have to look at each situation. You have to look at what your impact areas are. We have to look at where we're vulnerable. Do we have things in place? And if we don't, then that becomes those areas that we as an organization have to talk about for those mitigation, or look to, do we need to increase insurance? But that's not always, that's not always the only answer about increasing insurance. There's other ways that we can do that too. And so I don't believe that every situation is the same. I think we have to look at that. We have to sit with the stakeholders, have those conversations, and then we get to there through a process. So I don't have an exact answer for that.
And Claire, I will say that you're seeing a lot on the OMB, the contract procurement side. From an administrative standpoint, bringing together risk and insurance and that area with this group is in process. So we aren't at that point yet. We probably don't even have the right folks up here to answer that question for you today. So that's one of the maturities of the organization as we evolve forward.
Leslie, Administrator Shelton wanted to comment to Claire's question as well.
And Claire, the best investment that we made, first of all, there's no way to cover with insurance the type of losses that you could see sometimes with the law enforcement piece, because it's not covered by the tort caps. Most of those civil suits take place under Section 1983, which is the federal statute. So Minnesota's tort cap doesn't apply. So there is no way to actually insure against what the maximum of those could be. And the way that we protect against that, particularly within the sheriff's office, the best investment we made was in the training center, because it is about two things when it comes to the law enforcement and how do you mitigate that risk. It's what are their policies, and are the policies current, are they evidence-based, those types of things, and then is the training supporting what the policies are? Because generally where law enforcement falls down, where they get sued and lose, is when either the policy wasn't followed, or quite honestly, you know, they have a policy, no policy at all, or they have a policy that went back decades and really isn't appropriate, you know, in today's world. So it is probably you identified it correctly, it's probably the highest risk that we have, deals with law enforcement actions, because those are split-second decisions that they make. And to make them well, you have to have a really good policy, and then people have to be trained really well in what that policy is and what the proper uses of force and those types of things are, so that it becomes instinctive, so that they just do it naturally. And in that split second, they almost don't think about it. It just happens. If that, you know, that's your best protection, and even that's not 100%. So.
You want another? Sure, go ahead, Claire.
I was just wondering, you know, we have all of the paperwork and insurance requirements when someone is doing a contract with the county, if they're going to bid for something with the county. I mean, and like Commissioner Beer has a landscape company, and if he wanted to bid on a landscape project, there's a lot of paperwork that and insurance requirements. And I'm just wondering, you talked about levels of risk and how far do you want to go sometimes, but do you lose bidders because of that very often? And especially, do we kind of lose some of the small local businesses sometimes because we have so many requirements? And how do you balance that so that you don't necessarily lose so many and you only get the big guys in?
Maria, you've handled that. Go ahead.
Sure.
I was
think
gonna-
that's,
yeah.
I guess I would say, and I think that we try to do this, where we look at each situation that comes up, because I don't think that they're all the same. And we have some broad levels, but sometimes, depending on the level of risk, we would talk through those and we would want to make it, does that make sense for this particular situation?
And I'm thinking of bidding as you have to go out for bid when you're at a certain dollar amount, so that would.
That stuff, some of that
Would
is
be a choice.
statutorily required, and we need to follow that. That's more about like the bid limits, but I think, are you getting at, Claire, some of our insurance requirements and some of those pieces? And so, and again, I think then it becomes, we have to look at those, we have to have those conversations. Some of that is set for us, but then we do have some flexibility in certain situations to kind of look at that. I think it's an area that we need to continue to keep looking at, because I would share that same concern. We want to make sure that we are being open, we're being competitive, and people have an opportunity.
I think we have several examples, Claire, where we've had contractors, especially for small things like scale, where it's been facilitation, or it's been providing articles, or it's been providing communication, where it wasn't providing like a design for a highway, or it wasn't contracting out something for IT for design, which could have ramifications, where we have waived those insurance requirements so that we could have community or small local businesses participate instead of holding them to $1 million insurance requirement, which they're never going to carry in their business. So they actually have looked at that on an individual basis. I can think 3 off the top of my hat where we have waived those based on what it is we're doing and made a decision. The risk wasn't there. There's somebody from our community who could provide a good service.
And maybe some of the insurance, I see where, I was thinking more the statutorily required bids, but on those smaller ones, if they don't need environmental insurance, is a good one we deal with all the time too. They're not gonna be doing anything within the environment, then we can take that one off. Auto insurance is another one. We keep in all of them, but that one I know we've taken out too if they're not transporting people as part of that contract.
So we do try to look at it from an individual basis when we can, and look at the risk of that particular service or whatever it is that we're contracting for.
And we do get guidelines from our, the MCIT insurance that we work with as well. And then we set those limits, and I do believe those were adopted by the board as what we have in our boilerplate today. But we do have the ability to look at individual contracts and work through those.
What else? Quiet group this morning. All right, Mr. Chairman, it's all yours.
Members, you taking in the presentation, or any further questions, comments, or observations for the group on risk management?
I want to take the risk.
Yeah, right. We're measuring our risk at jeopardizing our lunch. That's what we're doing. Okay, tongue firmly in cheek, of course. Thank you for the presentation. Just from a housekeeping perspective, I think you've nailed the setup that works well for the board here and for the folks at home watching. I think we got that down. Thank you for your attention, and we understand this is a new program, and so we'll be paying attention to it over the next couple of years, those of us that survive on this board, and yeah, good.